My name's Andrew Reynolds. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chair of the City Architecture Forum. And this evening, I'm delighted to be your host for our latest event in our series, Revealing the City. The city, for the context of today, will be both the City of London, but I think the broader London, as Rowena and Peter will share their broader thoughts. Real estate, they always say, is all about timing. You know, the timing, and of course, I guess location, depending whether you're an estate agent or not. But I think our timing today is fantastic, with dear old Boris allowing us all to go to the pub last night and opening up London generally. I have to say I haven't been in since a while ago, but I'm told by everybody the city's much busier today. So long may that last. The day after the great opening, the reopening, today's speakers, I think, will give us a timely review of the future of the great city of London. We've already talked about, sorry, I've got somebody here. Is Despina speaking? I've got a question, sorry. I'll start again. What are we talking about? We're talking about the future of the city, the future of London. What is the future? Is it the future of the regular city commute? Is it the future of the 9 to 5 business day? Is it the future of still coming to work, to sit at a desk, to send emails to your colleagues across the floor? If in fact the new normal is going to be a hybrid, at least for those people who are not told to go to Goldman Sachs, 5 days a week, 7 days a week. When we come back to the office, when that will be, what will the office be? So today we're going to hear, first of all, from a great friend of mine and somebody who's well known to many of you on this call, I'm sure, and who I believe is the leading light on the whole workplace environment, certainly in the UK, since her kind of research work with DGW and Rosewell Stanhope back in the 80s on the Broadgate project. Now, Despina is the, let's get this right, Global Head of Total Workspace. Is that right, Despina? Yep.
It changes by the day.
Despina is going to give us a view. Oh, right. Well, she knows everything about the workplace, far more than any of us on this call, I'm sure. But anyway, what we're going to do is look at the city and how it's evolved since Peter and I were having a conversation with Despina just before we came on this call. Did London start in terms of the office with the coffee shop, that first coffee shop in Lloyd's back in 1686? You could say we've gone back to the coffee shop now, post-pandemic. We'll then be joined by Peter, who I'm sure everybody knows as chair of New London Architecture, a London Mayoral design advocate, and I think of somebody as really Mr. Built Environment in London, if I may call you that, Peter. Anyway, enough of me. Despina, over to you, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm just going to share my screen. So please tell me when you can see my screen.
Yeah, we're seeing you now.
Yep. Okay, perfect. So I think when we started talking about this event, Andrew asked me an interesting question about, thinking back on London and what's happened in the last few years. And he already made the reference to the origins of Lloyd's and the coffee houses of the 1800s. But I thought that rather than looking at the time between that origin and now, which is done, by the way, very effectively in Rob Harris's new book, The London's Global Office Economy, I wanted to look at the period that I've worked in London. So starting in 84 on Broadgate, and 84, 86 was a really interesting time with both Finsbury Avenue, Broadgate, and Lloyd's going up in London. And something really significant about the fact that those developments really looked at mirroring work process and aligning technology and work in new building typologies. And that, I think, was particularly important because looking at the timeline of Broadgate, and at the time we did a huge amount of research into the changing financial services organizations, changing professional firms, the introduction of the desktop. Well, by the time the second phases of Broadgate came about in the early 90s, the laptop had come about and the technology had started leaving the building. And then something really interesting happened where we saw the technology enabling us to work in the city, but also building typologies started taking on the form of the city. Most notably, I think, BA Waterside in 95, which is really a street embodying that the city in the office idea. By the time we get to 2002, there are two really interesting developments that happen. First of all, in New York City, Bryant Park offered free Wi-Fi, and the city as the office really came to life at that moment. And at the same time in London, we had the development of Chiswick Park, which actually, and Peter and I were talking about this a minute ago, whilst it's not doing many favors to its relationship to Chiswick as such, it takes on a very particular focus, which is an emphasis on people. So the whole brand of Enjoy Work, the simplicity of the building typology, and the emphasis on amenities and community means that Chiswick continues to this day to command significantly high rents, particularly because of the retention of colleagues in the organizations that work there through their friendships on the site itself, through all of the amenities and services. So what we've seen in the exploratory notion of this idea of people-centric and enjoyment of work at Chiswick is kind of where we're getting to today. We've had a year on Zoom, and the things, and I'll go back to that in more detail in a minute, that we've been missing are those social elements. It is the need to go back to the coffee house, the need to reuse the city in a completely different way. And I think when we look at Broadgate now and we look at New Exchange Park, which makes a very active nod to engaging the wider community, to reinventing that work and play environment within Broadgate, we look at the notion, I think, of what I've been calling this new spatial equity of using public realm to bring us together in unique ways. So I think I'd like to kind of come back to that, but it was just trying to frame just some thinking about typology of space and technology and where we are. But I wanted to sort of step back a little bit and look at 4 key things that were happening pre-COVID that I think are still incredibly critical to the city and to the office. And the first, of course, is the fact that we've been talking for a while about having 5 generations at work. And the buildings we're designing for at the moment are absolutely towards Gen Y and Z. And when we look at those 2 generations, they are predominantly focused on experience and social impact. And the organizations that are trying to retain these talent need to be able to bring that to life through the way they support them to work and through the environments within which they work. And of course, the thing that comes hand in hand with that has been a significant increase in the last 5 years in flexibility and convenience. The daily commute has been tolerated less and less. And we saw it just a year ago in CIPD survey saying that 78% of employees that don't have access to flexibility would like it because they want better work-life balance, increased productivity, and 1 in 2 people would actually change jobs to have access to more flexibility. And we had begun to collect some interesting data, again, pre-pandemic, that remote workers were actually having much better experiences and were more engaged than people that came to the office every day. Alongside that, we had this real emphasis, particularly starting with the tech industry, of beginning to treat employees like customers and focusing on unique experiences, hospitality. The hospitality mindset took over the real estate industry, certainly from the occupier point of view, again in the last 5 to 10 years, and very difficult to sort of step back from that. The next one that has been really critical is a focus on leveraging smart, healthy, and green buildings. And we saw that come into play in 2 ways, both in terms of embodying circular economy through reinventing of existing building types with technology and materials, but also through leveraging a sharing economy in a different way through a real rise in co-living and co-working. And then the third component of this, of course, well-being. In the last 5 years, pre-pandemic, from 2015 onwards, we saw this awareness that the building actually actively impacts our well-being and performance, with incredible data coming through that 1/3 of employee sick leave could be attributed to poor indoor air quality. Of course, in light of the pandemic, now that we've all become air quality experts, that kind of data piece becomes even more critical. But again, our experience per square foot data pre-pandemic showed that the ability to renew throughout the day lagged significantly behind every other aspects. So well-being, a critical driver for buildings in leading up to the pandemic. And then lastly, that kind of culminating in what I'd call a new commercial model for buildings. And as we're talking about the city, 22 Bishopsgate probably brings that to life more than any other single building. When I did the brief for the planning, for the space planning for 22, the concept was around creating a social building with people at the center, a vertical village that was activated through immersive, authentic amenities and services. So 22 brings together all of the elements of the sharing aspect of amenities, the experience, the art, the flexibility, the wellness through being the first core and shell building to achieve WELL certification, and the open framework to be able to connect your BMS to the cloud and have real-time data and analytics that allows you to manage your space in real time. So very much a culmination of all of those trends that we saw building up in the last 5 to 10 years. So at that moment, we kind of hit the pandemic and everything stops. And we took our experience per square foot survey and we pivoted it to experience per square foot at home. And we distributed it to our clients. And it was really interesting to begin to see what worked and what didn't in our remote work experience over the last year. And we definitely could all still work. 75% of people said they felt they could effectively focus and collaborate. And in fact, for the first time ever, 90% of them felt trusted to work remotely. And important to note, that figure was about 35% pre-pandemic. However, whilst we can still work, 1 in 2 of us struggles to remain connected to company culture, to remain connected to colleagues, to be able to feel that we are sharing information, we're being mentored, we are sharing knowledge effectively. 1 in 2 people don't feel particularly well. They are unable to create any kind of boundaries between work and life. And that ability to not take time away from work is beginning to have both physical and mental health implications. And those are particularly enhanced in younger generations. So 70% of younger people are struggling working remotely. And this, of course, was counterintuitive to us because we figured the younger generations were much more tech savvy. But it turns out that us baby boomers have had the best time working remotely because we have the social networks and we tend to have space at home to work in and not young children. So the combination of all those elements becomes really critical. Having said all that, 78% of people want to have flexibility post-pandemic. And that's incredibly important because when we look at the future, we're starting to really very much see that work is no longer going to happen in one place, but across a much more diverse workplace ecosystem, which involves a variety of locations and experiences that support convenience, functionality, and well-being. And if we think about that, there are a number of things that come up from it. Working from home is one of those locations. And it also opens up the opportunities of working near home, being able to walk or cycle locally, and possibly reimagine local areas in a completely new way. Working in a central office hub becomes even more important than ever before, because to get people to come to the office now means the office needs to become an inspiring destination that drives and supports all of the elements that we cannot do effectively remotely. And of course is supported by third places in the city and the vibrancy of the city to create that inspiring destination. We've heard a lot about the death of the office, everybody going remote or everybody coming back in. I think Andrew mentioned Goldman Sachs says everyone's coming back into the office, but actually when you look at the numbers, the future is not binary. Being in the office all of the time or being at home all of the time actually results in the lowest engagement scores. The sweet spot tends to be being in the office about 2.5 days a week. And what we see is that some recent data that from research we've done with CoreNet indicates that that means that hybrid work expectations have increased from 29% pre-pandemic to 81% post-pandemic. So much more dynamic workforce. What that means is that our clients are starting to look at 2 very significant shifts. One is realigning their workspace to support the drivers for coming to the office, those connections, collaborations, access to connectivity, to make the space more effective. But even more significantly, looking at how to leverage that ecosystem and realign the space and reallocate the space to optimize space efficiency, resilience, and employee experience. It begins to then frame what the role of place is in a context where we are increasingly able to work virtually. And we know that virtual work is personal and convenient, and it's allowed us to do all of the things we have been doing. Therefore, the more we begin to rely on this ubiquitous use of technology, I believe, the more we begin to look at physical space as a much more important embodiment of values, of brand, of meaning, of culture, of community. So physical space, the office, the role of the office becomes much more as a social condenser. Physical space is engaging and memorable, where virtual is simply convenient. So physical spaces will need to be designed to really bring these elements to life. And layered into that, we have this new, incredibly exciting opportunity to use emerging technology to give us real-time data and a completely new type of user interface, both in terms of how the physical space is impacting our experience and our well-being, how we're driving the optimization of the space in terms of the capacity, building access and energy and sustainability, and of course, most significantly, how we are supporting effective collaboration community through this engagement of technology. And I think the engagement of technology will happen both at the level of the building, but also more importantly, and increasingly at the level of the city. So the two begin to come hand in hand. So what I think we're looking at is a number of things happening, an increase of mobility of people, which will mean an intensity of use of space and a focus on experience, an increased simplicity of buildings, much more looser fit and adaptable with highly serviced amenities and events, and a much greater increase in the complexity of places, that ecosystem of locations, a blurring of work, live, play, and learn with a focus on community. And my last thing I want to note is that as we see this shift, we're seeing a very significant shift in the value of buildings. So a real, a new emphasis on not just looking at cheaper and cost savings, but actually at the opportunity to decrease and reduce the right things. So decrease useless space, wasted time, absenteeism, stress, and carbon, and increase engagement, inclusion, ideas, collaboration, trust, and well-being. So I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing. And I think you're on mute, Andrew.
I'm there. Perfect. That's really got the mind going. Peter, any first thoughts?
Yes, I thought it was interesting that Despina showed the picture of the new design for Exchange Square, because I think one image that is missing is also how Broadgate Square has been used in recent years, because it used to be an ice rink, of course, which was New York precedence and worked pretty well, but actually more recently it's been changed into much more of a party space. So you go there at 6 o'clock in the evening, it is absolutely rammed, quite astonishing, really. And I think if you connect that with what you're saying about younger people finding it difficult to accommodate themselves with home working, I mean, I think they're the people who are going to need the city, need that activity. And the Ned is another place which is quite astonishing in how it delivers that sort of social aspect, which I think is going to become more and more important really over time. So that's not about healthy cities, I don't think, but it's about social cities, and I think that's very important. I think that I mean, it's also just very interesting to look back at Broadgate at that time when you were working there. Rob Harris was working there. That it was and I think it's very relevant in terms of how the city responds to the situation we find ourselves in now, because the city hadn't really prepared itself. The draft plan at the beginning of the 80s was conservation oriented. It wanted to discourage the loss of wholesale and industrial premises, which was being lost at the time and had now been totally lost. But and people like G. Ware Travelstead or C.S. First Bottom were frustrated at being able to get things through, thus Canary Wharf. And it was only when Michael Cassidy, 1986, came in as chairman of Planning and Transportation, with a policy with Peter Rees, a balance between new development and delivering space for financial services, but also something that maintained the character of the city. And I think that ability to respond very quickly, in fact, and actually start delivering accommodation for this new sector which had arrived, and which, as I say, I don't think the city had been totally prepared for. It was a fairly remarkable recovery, despite the fact that in 1988, 89, things started to go bad because of the economy. But it was a remarkable change, which then, of course, created London as the world's financial capital. So, the resilience of the city is something which is talked about a lot, and it's what is it that allows it to be that resilient? Michael Wellbank, when he was chairman of Planning and Transportation, would talk about this city corporation then being more like a development corporation rather than a sort of planning authority, something that actually was encouraging change and development. Yet somewhere like Canary Wharf, which was really essential to the growth of financial services at that time, by providing accommodation which wasn't available in the city, almost happened by accident, or at least by private sector initiative, to go to an enterprise zone which had benefits of low planning control and a certain amount of support in terms of rate reductions, that suddenly saw an opportunity to deliver something totally different, which was accidental. And I think our let's say pragmatic planning system, plus I think that the city's very particular view of the way it delivers planning is a very important part in the way that the city can recover. But I think what is very important is not just the what is the office on its own, what is the office within the context of its wider environment, which is why I am slightly critical of Chiswick Park, because it's a sort of out of town development in town, and is almost segregated. We're literally segregated from local community. I think one of the very interesting things is there are a number of people who have talked about whether the city needs to review its policy of not liking residential development within the city itself, but I think that the idea of mixed-use environments is clearly something which has come to the fore with the idea of the 15-minute city and that sort of thing. And I think it's also very interesting if you look back to see what happened in Lower Manhattan after 9/11, which Lower Manhattan was, and Wall Street was a purely office environment, or mainly office environment. But in the post 9/11 replanning has actually now shifted into being a much more mixed use area, and I think very successful for it.
Thank you, Peter. So yeah, they are our first thoughts. We welcome questions from our dear audience out there. Rowena, speed of change. What in your head? Do we see a trickle back? Do we see a trickle in the changes of the big corporates? I said tongue in cheek, Goldman Sachs have said you've got to come back. We've seen Google, Amazon changing their laissez-faire. What does the global kind of picture tell you rather than just London? Because I think we tend to be dominated by our media stories, don't we? It's either black or white. We're never kind of in the middle.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because the important thing at the moment is that the reality is nobody knows exactly how it's going to play out. And the reason for that is quite significant. So we did some modeling on this whole hybrid working and what happens when you shift from being in the office 5 days a week to being in the office 2.5 days a week. And something really interesting happens. First of all, probability of running into colleagues goes from over 80% to less than 25%. So whilst everyone wants flexibility, in order for flexibility to be effective, it needs to be actively managed. And that is a much bigger and more complicated piece of work than just thinking about adjusting your office environment, because that requires management behavioral change. So I tend to think that one of the things we need to look out for is to what extent will managers at a moment of dramatic change and urgency to re-engage economically will take the time to really do the work that they need to do to make a new flexible experience really be effective. And I think that's going to be a sliding scale. The clients that we've been working with that are, I think, the most interesting are the ones that are actively taking this and approaching it from a kind of agile mindset. And they're looking to pilot, to test, to iterate, and to use the next few months, the next year, and to acknowledge that they don't know the answer and to embrace uncertainty and to think about this new transition as a period of implementing change and taking both the people and their building decisions with them.
Despina, that's quite a bold admission, though, isn't it, to say we don't know, because our industry is tends to be polarized, doesn't it? You know, we'd had this conversation a year ago. The office was dead, wasn't it? After 1 month, you know, nobody's going to go back. We hate it. We don't want to go back. Even in I think in the last probably 6 weeks, we've seen that sea change, haven't we, with the big corporates? You know,
Yes.
you've got to be in to win.
But I think it's a very difficult issue for our industry, Andrew, because we tend to deal in absolutes, right? We want, what's the depth of the floor? What's the height? It's always the answer. And the more buildings go closer to focusing on people and enabling people, the more uncertain that answer becomes. It's not either or, it's both. And I think that part of the reason why I said we will see much simpler, looser fit buildings that adapt more like a stage set is that our buildings will need to be able to ensure they get some of the big fixes right, but then be able to respond, particularly as we will now have real-time data on both use and experience. And I think it really changes the way we perceive what the optimum specification for a building will be, what the optimum performance of a building will be.
But how do you see this being the balance between, might say, corporate and individual perspectives? Clearly, you've done research and people are saying, I hate working home, like working home, want to go back to the office. And then you have senior executives from Goldman Sachs saying, you've all got to come back to the office. You've got Schroders saying, we're going to give up our office. How do you see that shaping up in terms of who actually decides? It's not going to be, let's say, a democratic decision by staff, is it? Or can management actually enforce it on their staff? How do you think those decisions are going to be made?
I think the majority of clients that I've been working with are looking at this in both directions, both top down and bottom up. And I think it's really important to understand what people's sentiment is, particularly in the short term, Peter. There's a huge amount of anxiety that people have about commuting, particularly in cities like London and New York, where we have such a large percentage of the population that are commuting. Interestingly, we've been looking at lessons learned from Sydney and Melbourne, who opened up and have very, very low, if no transmission rates. And still we see occupancy no more than 60%, even in cities where commuting, frankly, on a boat in Sydney is very different to commuting in the London Tube. So there is apprehension, there is anxiety, and management is taking that into account. And that's why I think enlightened companies are using this period to be able to explore new models. But even when we look at these big, bold statements, the Goldman Sachs, Facebook, Facebook came out and said they were doing remote recruiting. But actually, when you listen to that announcement that Mark Zuckerberg made, the first thing he says is that building culture takes a long time and requires people to be together. And those are the elements that are at risk. And that is where physical place, the office, the city, the ability of people to come together is so essential and will continue to be.
Despina, sorry, I've got a few questions here, if I may just kind of put them out here in no particular order. So we've got one here. We've talked about new and looser fits, but corollary to that is how can the 19th century and the 20th century buildings that we've got, obviously, fundamental part of that layering of our city, how can they be adapted in the same way as new buildings? Or is there going to be a kind of an appeal, a hierarchy that means, maybe to Peter's point, we do see residential come into the city, which is currently not with the city corporation because they don't like the rights of light impact, but maybe there's a fundamental change there. I'll be interested to hear both of your views.
I definitely think introducing more mixed use into the city is really critical to create more vibrancy and more resiliency in the city. I think it's also important to note that the majority of occupiers in the city are actually not large companies. And therefore, buildings that might appear to be quite constrained older buildings are not as inflexible as we might think. So we tend to focus on the very small percentage of really large occupiers, but that's not what makes up the city itself.
So it's more graduated, I guess, isn't it, really? Sorry, I was just interrupted you there, Peter. Yeah.
No, I mean, I agree that some sort of mixed use, whether it's residential or something else. And there's another question about on 2.5 days a week in the city, what will happen to hospitality outlets? I mean, I think that's related, that actually you want other things happening in the city. And so one answer might be to build the tulip for a start. But also, I mean, it's quite interesting to go to the city at weekends.
Indeed.
Actually, there is activity around the walkie-talkie because there are people going up there, and it's a draw, and coffee shops are open there, whereas in fact there are none open in the centre of the city yet. There are ways of drawing people into the city, and certainly the culture mile is going to be one of those things which will help. And I think also the city should be making much more of its amazing historic heritage. Really, the churches aren't really seen as there are lots of guided walks around the churches, but if you take the city churches and the livery halls together, that is the most amazing collection of heritage that most visitors don't know anything about. And actually, of course, most of the livery halls are closed to visitors most of the time anyway, but you know, there are amazing resources, and I think probably there should be more residential, but I think there are plenty of other ways of getting people in who will use the pubs, the restaurants, and other amenities.
I think it's really interesting that Peter mentioned the livery halls. Actually, Rob Harris and I did a piece of work for the city in 2015 on looking at future workspaces and future work styles for the city. One of the main themes that came out of that study was the need for greater permeability and the connecting to memorable places within the city. And, you know, everything I talked about in terms of why would you choose to go somewhere is around unique, memorable experiences. And therefore, leveraging that heritage of the city is critical to it, as well as layering activation and culture and events that actually bring people into the city that are not necessarily reliant on just working in the city.
I think it's that whole permeability, but opening up the spaces between buildings, historic spaces, new spaces. I think
Exactly.
it's getting there, isn't it? Because it talks about its aspiration for 24/7, and to Peter's point, the 7-day city. You know, it'll be interesting as you know to what extent the hybrid will engage people working different hours. Do they take their kids to school and come in? Do they work at the weekends? Because they can bring their kids in to do something in the city. That to me, that's a little bit like the south end of Manhattan, isn't it, Peter? That whole kind of downtown has changed completely.
Yeah.
I think the city needs to embrace that bigger change.
And the difference is dramatic. You know, in 1986, other than Leadenhall Market, there was no retail in the city. There was nothing.
Yeah.
But
So,
ironically, Leadenhall Market before the pandemic was suffering because it had kind of lost its identity. You know, I talk about that in the context of the schemes we're trying to do around the corner. They were personified by the two boozy pubs dominating the open spaces rather than attracting people. I think you know that needs to emerge. To your point about social experience, the 5 generations rather than the guys who drink pints and smoke cigarettes. That's a personal view. We've got a couple more questions here. Daryl Chen, interesting one, Daryl, absolutely love it. Is it enough to turn tall buildings into gated communities that provide more life indoors? I don't think he's mentioning 22, but he's referring. Or should buildings interact with the city better?
I think they should do both. I don't think the intention is about turning tall buildings into gated communities. I think the intention is more around activating tall buildings, which is significant because if you look at historical high-rise buildings, they are really disconnected as communities. Yeah. So activation within the building and across the public realm are both essential. So again, it's not an either or. It's really about both.
I think it's the permeability is across the sites, isn't it? It's through the sites. I know you've done that at 20.
It's both vertical. It's permeability, vertical and horizontal. Yeah. And I think we need to think about buildings in that way. As they become more dynamically used, they need to become more permeable in multiple directions. And of course, with facial recognition, with more technology, security doesn't need to be the barrier that it's been historically.
But I agree. And buildings generally need to engage with their neighbours more actively than is often the case with office buildings, and not only tall buildings, all buildings. And I think the Bloomberg policy is very interesting. The Bloomberg building, where when they're up in Finsbury Square, everyone in Bloomberg had lunch in the office. Now they're encouraged to leave the office at lunchtime and go out and use the restaurants and so on in the area. And I think that's a very good thing. And I believe that actually in Google up in King's Cross are having all their amenities within the building. And that's not good for the area. It's really, people need to get out and about, because I mean the value of the area around it is important to the office space, because it is a part of the social life of people working in those offices. So I think that we need to look at buildings and their connections to their surrounding areas and the amenities within them. Even
I wonder how Google will change, given what we've discussed on this call. That whole kind of, why would you want to stay in the building when there's everything out there? That cohesion with the social spaces. You know, if you take the flex and the loose fit idea that Despina I think, you know, those buildings are going to be shells, aren't they, which have to adapt, change over time, probably much more quickly. What about landlords, Despina? Obviously, we're talking about our occupiers, globally occupiers, but have you been grilled by occupiers about whether there's going to be a valuation shift, a valuation premium?
Well, I think the expectations on landlords have shifted dramatically. And I think, you know, we saw that 22 Bishopsgate is an immediate example of that, right? Many of the occupiers that are going into 22 actively want to leverage the amenities that 22 provides and expect the landlord to provide that. I think interestingly enough, I've been doing a study for a landlord in London on future expectations of occupiers. And consistently across the board, over 30 occupiers that I've spoken to have said they now will expect to have amenity spaces, flex, event spaces within the building or nearby available for them to use. They expect the landlord to provide more flexibility, more adaptability, and to cater to all of the elements that I was talking earlier around well-being and sustainability. So the role and the relationship between landlord and tenant is changing dramatically. And those metrics that I showed, those changing metrics, we did a bit of analysis for one of the tenants that went into 22 on their annual cost of real estate in the city. This is a 100,000 square foot user, was £5 million per annum. Their annual cost of people was £35 million per annum. And they estimated the value of one productive hour to be £2.5 million per annum. So if the building can demonstrate that it can increase the productivity or the engagement by 2 hours a year, that basically gives you a cost neutral building. It's a very different way of thinking about it. So I think we're going to see completely new types of business cases being developed.
And do you think, to that logic, do you think that the more enlightened landlords, if you will be looking to make money, rentalize those, what I call experience spaces, or they'll realize that, as in a hotel, people come to stay in the hotel because of the amenity and you're not expecting to pay extra for it?
I think it's both, Andrew, definitely both. The other area where I'm seeing a lot of landlords investing in, both in London, in New York, and certainly in Asia, is that technology interface. So we've been working with a lot of landlords to bring, for example, our experience metrics into apps they're developing to track well-being, to track entrance, to health and safety, as well as utilization of space. So landlords are taking a much more active management role and provision of space, and certainly experience. You know, I said right at the beginning that if you're in real estate, you're in hospitality, and that if that was the trend pre-pandemic, it is more than now. It's no longer a trend, it's a basic expectation.
Do all the landlords, the institutional investors that you're working with, get that? Because I would say that, you know, not necessarily, because it's that kind of, how much more do I have to invest in my specification, whereas the reality is, I think we're saying maybe you ramp back your specification of your office space and you invest more in your, amenity space, even though you're not getting a rent from it. You're going to get rent presumably be better on the office itself.
Yeah, I think definitely they're getting it. And if they're not getting it, we will definitely see a sort of drive to quality of experience.
So a flight to Cat A, but the Cat A will include a huge kind of stage set of amenity space, as it were. So your old-fashioned BCO breaking news kind of go in the lobby, it's marble, it's reception, it's lift, it's come out. The ground floor's got to change completely.
Yes, I think exactly. It's all about inspiring people to want to be there. Right. So that implies a very active management of the experience that happens within the certainly the common areas of the building.
Okay. Conscious of time, a couple more questions if I just go through those. What do you see as the future of suburban centres? Will they grow significantly with more local working? And I guess if they do, what type of space would be located there? So to avoid that daily commute, perhaps.
Yes, I mean, I think they're definitely going to gain from this. There's no doubt about it. I think as the restaurants and pubs of the city suffer, so the one in your local area will get that extra business that you would have brought to it on those 2.5 days that you're not in the office. So there is definitely going to be an upswing, and I think that actually that is it's one of London's great strengths as a city, and in the whole discussion about the 15-minute city, which I think this also relates to, is that we are pretty polycentric. There are many areas of London which are already 15-minute cities where people are easily in touch with all their basic amenities, unlike Paris, where they have a lot of work to do to actually create that more equitable division of amenities within areas. And so I think that's that polycentric nature of London is a huge strength. I think how much the hub and spoke in this sort of network economy, how big the hubs are in relationship to the centre, I think will vary, but I think there certainly will be more workspaces for all those people who actually want to work near where they live, but they don't want to go into the centre every time. And it could be that more companies, where they have a lot of workers in one particular area, they may well create their own hubs there. And I mean that's a strategy which has been discussed for a number of years before COVID, but we might actually see it now taking place. So yeah, I think this is probably, as we have actually seen during lockdown, a positive thing for local streets, local retailers, and local businesses generally.
Despina, any view on that?
I totally agree with what Peter said. I mean, we've seen a couple of things happen in this vein. One is with occupier clients who have retail as part of their portfolio. There's been an increased opportunity to leverage retail. For example, banks that have retail branches leverage branches as touchdown work environments in areas where they have clusters of employees, as Peter was talking about. The other thing that's interesting is that both IWG and WeWork are looking at suburban and high street locations, and many of our clients are enrolling in that kind of touchdown passport idea that you can just walk to your local area or cycle and use a touchdown environment, which gets you out of the house and connects you to your local community.
And I guess the metric on all this, Despina, will be back to the 5 generations, won't it? Because part of that cultural piece is if you're the youngster, you're not going to want to go to that spoke location. You're going to want to go in and meet the big boss, aren't you? And get your water cooler moment. So there's going to be flexibility within organizations, and yeah, so it is not one size fits all, is it? Even for
No.
the civil servant types. Great. Okay, well, I think we're just about done in terms of time. So thank you very much. Despina, my apologies. I keep confusing your name with Rowena. I'm just bloody hopeless on things like that, but apologies. Peter, thank you again, as ever, for your kind of wisdom. Thank you all for attending today.